Hi there. Here's a short topic video looking at some of the issues facing transition economies. So transition economies are economies that are making the transition from a state-led economic model towards more of a market economy. The 2014 World Economic Situation and Prospects Report, published by the United Nations, has a listing of transition economies. And here are some good examples, including countries such as Albania, Bosnia, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and quite a few of the Commonwealth of Independent States, including countries like Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, and also Ukraine. So those are good examples of transition economies. So the key point really is that transition economies are involved in a process of moving from being essentially a centrally planned economy more towards being a mixed economy, a mix of public and private sector organisations, or even further towards being a free market based economy where the size of the state and the scope of the state is much less. Now again the key point here is that this is a process, it's not an event, and the speed with which the transition takes place and the extent of the transition will clearly vary from country to country. But there are some key aspects of the transition process that are common to many countries. First of all, one of the most important aspects is the liberalization of markets. In other words, giving market prices, or the price mechanism, a bigger role, a more significant role in allocating scarce resources. Transition also involves oftentimes the privatization of government assets, in other words, the transfer of state assets into the private sector. In many transition countries, in part preparation for joining the European Union, have reduced their import tariffs and other trade barriers such as import quotas, so that the economy as a whole becomes more open to trade and capital flows. In many countries, the scale and the extent of government subsidy has been reduced, particularly to industries that traditionally have made losses. And a key part of transition is to give a greater role to private property, and that requires reform of the legal system so that property rights can be protected more easily. Transition could also involve some reforms to banking and also liberalising the interest rate setting so that interest rates are set more by the money markets rather than by the state. So these are some of the key aspects of the transition process. However, transition of course is not without its difficulties, bumps and hollows along the road. Indeed, we find that many of the transition countries have suffered tremendously difficult economic times during the transition process, often involving huge losses of output and very high unemployment. Here are just a few of the problems that transition countries have faced. The first problem is that if you take away subsidy from industries that have been heavily reliant on it in the past, that can lead to a significant short-term spike in unemployment as unprofitable businesses devoid of subsidy shed many thousands of jobs. We've seen that happen a lot. Likewise, if you take away controls over prices, things like price ceilings or government subsidies, you often see a significant rise in inflation. Indeed, in some cases we've seen some hyperinflation as the prices adjust to what would be the norm in the free market. In some cases, transition has led to deep recession. For example, be Georgia, where there's been a huge loss of output. Obviously, recovery since, there was quite rapid recovery in many cases, but a very steep recession. Another aspect is that transition countries often are behind the curve in terms of competitiveness. Many of the countries, they're a long way behind the technological frontier, and when they're exposed to market forces, the absence or the lack of price and non-price competitiveness means that they run into big trade deficit problems, particularly as consumers start to buy imports of consumer goods at cheaper prices. Corruption is a massive problem in many of these countries. It's proved difficult to reduce, and we often see in transition economies, certainly in the short term, a much higher level of income and wealth inequality, as measured, for example, by the Gini coefficient. And point 7, I think, is really linked to the previous 6 points, that in quite a few of these transition economies there has been depopulation effects. In other words, younger skilled workers frustrated with a lack of employment opportunities in their home country may decide to leave their economy in search of higher pay and better opportunities. So many transition countries have suffered a brain drain effect, often of the younger and more skilled workers. And this has put big pressure on for example, their public services. So these are some of the key problems that transition countries have faced during the process to transition.